Welcome to the second part of this series on designing sound images. This episode will focus on combining multiple microphones. And the first question that arises is why you would want to use multiple microphones in the first place. There are basically two main reasons to record something using more than one microphone. The first reason is added control in complex recording situations. So you can imagine if you record an orchestra or a band all at once, that you can't be entirely sure that the balance won't change throughout the various songs that they're going to play. And it can be quite difficult to find just one spot that has optimal balance in the first place. So in these cases it makes a lot of sense to add microphones for the various instruments at play, because those gain you some extra control over the balance during mixing. The second reason to use more than one microphone is to capture a physically large instrument like a grand piano or a drum kit. And you can compare it to capturing a sports match for television using only one camera. So if you want to capture the entire field with all the players in it, you need to place that one camera at a large distance. A similar thing happens if you try to record a grand piano with one microphone. So in order for you to prevent an area of the piano being relatively close to the microphone compared to another area, you need to increase the microphone distance. So this evens out these differences in distance between areas of the instrument and the microphone, leading to a more balanced pickup. But at a large distance required for such a large instrument, also room reflections start to play a major role in the recording, and they tend to shrinken the sound of the piano a bit and make it seem distant and insignificant. So the solution is quite similar to what they do at sports matches in combining multiple cameras and sewing the pictures together into one image. We can use multiple microphones for different areas of the piano and try to sew them together as seamlessly as possible into one image of the piano that feels intimate and complete. You get where this is going. Seamlessly is more easily said than done. So let's get started and find out how we can make it work. If we look at the first graph, you can see the mechanism of varying distance ratios compared to microphone distance at play. So physically large instruments like a grand piano can also be seen as a collection of sound sources, each sound source being at its own distinct distance from the microphone. So these ratios are expressed in numbers in these graphs, and in graph A you can see that they're pretty even ratios. So the farthest side of the piano is at a ratio of 6, while the closest side of the piano is at a ratio of 4 to the microphone. Now this isn't too extreme, so this microphone actually has a good chance to pick up pretty even sound. But then if we move the microphone closer, like in graphs B and C, you can see the ratios getting much more extreme. So 2 to 1 to 1, for instance, in B. And in C, where the microphone is placed under the lid in the middle of the piano, extreme ratios like 8 to 1 to 8 can exist. Now this microphone can impossibly pick up a balanced picture of the entire instrument. So the area which is closest will be featured much more than the areas which are further away from the microphone. So that makes option A really the only valid option of recording this instrument in a balanced way. But that has difficulties in its own right, since the microphone needs to be placed so far away that it can only work if the acoustics cooperate. And this is the case in large rooms where the reflections are relatively soft in relationship to the direct sound and arrive relatively late. But in most studios or even smaller rooms, option A isn't valid because the reflections will be so prominent that the piano will sound small. So we need to look at alternatives. Here you can see the principle of using zone microphones at play. These microphones are meant to pick up a distinct area of the instrument and then add together as seamlessly as possible. You can see that it's never going to be perfect. So the predicted amplitude responses are drawn below in the graph. So on the vertical axis you see amplitude, and on the horizontal axis you see pitch, which actually stands for the location of the sound source in relation to the keyboard drawn above. So you can see that if you place the microphones close together, like setup B, that there's a lot of overlap between them, which leads to a bump in the mid-range of the instrument. And if you place the microphones close to the instrument, you'll emphasize the distances and differences between the different areas of the instrument. So setup A has a lot of unevenness when it comes to the outer ranges of the instrument, so they are less prominent in setup A. So setup C is the best compromise in this case, but even that is far from perfect. That has to do with the way the microphones interact. So they'll overlap in a particular area, and that overlap will create a crossover, if you will, from the one microphone to the other microphone. This is being drawn in this image. Ideally, you would create a smooth crossfade between the two halves of the piano, leading to a perfect response as portrayed in graph A. In real life, there are various areas of the instrument, or actually various frequencies that the instrument produces, that arrive in phase and out of phase between these different microphones. And when you add them together, they'll add up or cancel out. So a filter is formed. In graph B, you can see the consequences of that. So in the overlapping area between the microphones, the response will be uneven. To minimize unevenness, it's a good idea to keep the crossover region between microphones as narrow as possible. So if there's less overlap, there's less phase interaction. In using microphones, that can be quite a challenge, since a microphone, in contrary to a camera lens, doesn't cut off the image at a distinct boundary. The best it can do is be a bit less sensitive in a particular direction than in another. You can, however, use microphone directivity to your advantage in creating these narrow crossovers. So if you look at the images drawn here, you see the effect of using 3 different microphone setups, one using omnidirectional microphones, one using cardioids, and one using figure of 8s. And each microphone setup is positioned in such a way that it renders the most even pickup of the piano with the most narrow crossover region possible. And you can see that the omnidirectional microphones have the largest crossover region, so they overlap the most. While the cardioid microphones actually can use their decreased sensitivity on the sides to narrow the crossover region. So you can see that they're actually delivering a narrower crossover. The figure of 8 has the strongest directivity of the microphones. So you can see that that leads to the most narrow crossover region possible. But in this case, probably the most even sounding setup would be the cardioids, since they also deliver good amplitude response on the left and right extremes of the instrument. So far, I've oversimplified things a bit. As you know, a piano is not a two-dimensional object, but it's a three-dimensional instrument generating different frequency components at different locations in space. So you may optimize your 2 microphone setup to add up perfectly for one frequency arriving from one particular direction, but then the next frequency arrives, or sound from a different direction arrives, and the addition will be totally different. This is a complex problem to which no perfect solution exists. So using a 2 microphone system therefore becomes a matter of looking for the lessest of evils. If you look with me at this diagram, you can see the mechanisms at play. Basically, you can influence 2 properties of the sound. One is the difference in arrival time between microphones, and 2 is the difference in amplitude between the 2 microphones. So if you look at setup A, the microphones are further away from the instrument, thereby leading to a smaller difference in distance. So actually the phase shift between the 2 microphones is smaller, but they do pick up more overlap, so the amplitude difference is also smaller. And if you look at setup B, if you place the microphones closer to the instrument, obviously you'll generate more separation between the halves of the instrument, so there's less overlap. A bigger difference in amplitude and pickup, as you can see in graph B, but also the difference in distance is bigger, so there's also a bigger phase shift involved. And in this case, for the fundamental of the particular note being played, the D sharp, the phase shift actually renders the overlap to be out of phase, attenuating the sound. So it becomes a matter of listening to the instrument and finding out which notes stick out, or which frequency components stick out, and which notes are barely audible. And then you can manipulate the distances between the microphones and the instrument in such a way that you even out some of these imbalances and look for the best compromise. It's good to mention that recording an instrument with two zone microphones, like we just talked about, isn't the same as recording an instrument in traditional stereo. So while it's perfectly possible to pan the zone microphones hard left and right, it will render a completely different perspective than what you would get from a normal stereo recording. I've tried to visualize that in this graph, and in graph A you can see a traditional stereo recording. As you can see, that still requires some distance, and it will render a virtual projection of the instrument in its context, so in the room. In this case, the acoustics determine the size of the world. If you look at using zone microphones like we talked about, then you end up with perspectives being displayed in graph B and C. It's somewhat abstract, but what I mean by these graphs is that you, as a listener, envision yourself to be inside the instrument, and the instrument determines the size of the world. These are actually pretty popular perspectives to use in pop music, especially if you deal with sparse arrangements, so just piano and vocals for instance. It could work great to have the piano determine the size of the world and to place the vocal in the world of the piano, so a perspective like graph B would actually work great for that. But it isn't the same as traditional stereo projection, so that's good to be aware of. Panning the microphones, however, can help you a great deal in getting a better addition between the two microphones. So if you add them together in mono, you'll be painfully aware that the interaction effects that we just talked about are at play. So you'll hear the phase interaction, you'll hear the thinning of the sound. If you spread them out in stereo, so pan them to opposite sides, your brain is actually allowed to add them up. And your brain does it in a different way than a computer does or than a mixing console does. Your brain is actually very used to hearing phase differences between your ears, and you don't hear them as comb filtering, you hear them as localization information. So sounds arriving from a particular side also arrive earlier at one side of your head than at the other side, and your brain just gels them together into a coherent whole. So your brain is actually more capable of adding up these two zone microphones in a sensible way than your mixer is. I have an example of that, so bear with me. I'll play some music by a band which was recorded live. They're called Marble Sounds. And the piano was recorded with two microphones up close, also to prevent leakage from other instruments. So this is basically a part of the song. Let me solo up the piano. You can hear that I've spread out the piano in stereo, and this was a requirement. So if I didn't hard pan these microphones left and right, they wouldn't add up so nicely to a balanced sounding piano. And this is something that you can't ever manipulate after the fact, so I can't move microphones during mixing. So hard panning was the only option, and let me demonstrate what would happen if I didn't do that. So you hear that the unbalance the two microphones render in mono is completely obvious. So you hear a particular bass frequency being emphasized, you hear a hole in the middle. And when you spread out these microphones, you just hear a three-dimensional piano without these imbalances. So sometimes panning these microphones can help you get a better overall sound. But bear in mind that it falls apart when you listen to it in mono, obviously. And it takes up a lot of space in the mix, so it becomes determinant of the entire perspective of the mix. Once you cross the bridge of recording something with multiple microphones, it's best to aim for as little crosstalk as possible, since crosstalk leads to image blurring. If you look at these graphs here, you can see that recording something with one microphone, like in graph A, leads to a perfectly sharp image. The only thing that can be said about it is that it maybe feel a bit distant, since the microphone has to be placed at quite a distance to capture the entire image. So that's reason enough, in some cases, to use more microphones to bring the contents closer to the listener. So in graph B you see that every source now has its own microphone. These microphones actually capture not only the sources that they're aimed at, but obviously also parts of the other sources, which are then added in the image as double images. So the image rendered by setup B tends to be quite blurry and unclear. This can be partly solved by using more directional microphones and by aiming them carefully to minimize crosstalk between the different subjects in the picture. So in setup C you're allowed to create a sharper looking picture by combining the microphones than in setup B. Since we've been mainly talking about the problems of adding multiple microphones together, I thought it would be good to take it one step back and see if there aren't any other solutions to be found to solve similar problems that you would solve with adding extra microphones. And the main problem, obviously, is balance. So one part of an instrument or one part of an ensemble is too low in volume in relation to another part. So you need an extra microphone to bring it out. But in some cases, there are other ways to sort of get more out of the one microphone that you're using. So if you look with me on this graph, you can see that it could be possible to record a drum kit with one microphone, but there is a risk that, for instance, the kick, since it's the furthest away from the microphone, will be the lowest in level. Now, obviously, the kick drum mainly has low frequency emphasis. So you could also think of EQing the microphone radically to bring out the kick drum more in the overall result. And this keeps the image very clear, so you don't introduce a kick drum microphone which would introduce leakage and image blurring. So you can also see on the impulse responses that I've drawn that it remains very clear. If you were to add a kick drum microphone, that wouldn't be the case. So you can see that there's two things going on. One, the microphones will overlap. You get a filtered response, so the comb filtering in the crosstalk will be apparent in the frequency spectrum. And also the impulse will feel less tight, so you get an extra source that is spread out in time. And even when the snare is playing, the bleed from the snare in the kick drum mic will also blur out the snare drum a bit. So this isn't ideal by any case, which makes the EQ option quite attractive actually. EQ can't always save the day, so if you look at the third graph you can see that the microphone is positioned differently in this case, bringing out the resonance of the floor tom more. And if you now try to add more kick drum with EQ, you'll also emphasize the resonance in the floor tom. So this is something that EQ can't do. If there's a conflict in the balance within one microphone, you can't solve it with EQ. Let's wrap it up with an example that actually illustrates this approach of using EQ, and in this case also compression, to even out the balance present in one microphone, so you don't have to use any other microphone to complement that balance. We're going to be listening to a drum mix I did the other day, which was recorded in a very nice sounding room with a good drummer, so that helps a great deal. And I composed this mix out of 4 microphones, so I didn't use any of the closed microphones for the individual drums. What you'll hear are only overheads and room mics, and well, quite some EQ and compression to get it to my liking in context of this mix. I'll start by playing the original recording and then switch to the processed version. Okay, so if you hear it in solo, it always sounds like you're going overboard with the compression, but actually I liked it in the context of the track. And And you can hear that you can use quite a lot of processing without actually destroying the sound. This is because there isn't any sound present that I don't need. So everything is potentially valuable. I just need to shape it so it fits the shape that I'm after in the mix. But I'm not running into any problems due to microphone bleed and comb filtering, etc. Okay, that was that. Next time we'll look at the use of ambience microphones to shape the surroundings of your image.